So my guest this week is Lila Zucker. Lila and I actually worked together on a political campaign in Baltimore, Maryland, although she's joining me right now from New Orleans. Lila has worked pretty extensively in labor and in electoral politics as well. Most recently in the 2018 cycle, she worked with the Georgia Democratic Party on their coordinated campaign as a regional field director. Lila, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Christian.
And did I get your most recent title correct?
Yes, you did.
Okay. I wanted to make sure. I didn't want to say anything inaccurate.
Nope.
So, one thing, the main reason why I wanted to chat with you is because you had an experience that a lot of folks kind of followed on TV from afar, but didn't get to live. And that was working in Georgia during this really kind of crazy, honestly, and contentious gubernatorial campaign in 2018. Can you just kind of tell us what your role was there, what you were doing on the ground, and where in the state you were operating?
Sure. So, like you said, I was a regional field director, and I was in just north of Atlanta. So I oversaw field organizers in our field program in parts of North Fulton, North DeKalb, Hall, Cherokee, and Forsyth County during the general election, and then in Gwinnett County during the runoff. And so my job was to mentor, supervise, and support 8 field organizers during the general election and 5 during the runoff as they worked with volunteers to train them and support them in talking to voters by knocking on their doors and making phone calls and getting the word out about the Democratic candidates and working with folks to make sure that they had the information and resources they needed to actually go out and vote.
Well, that sounds like a ton of work. I'm guessing there wasn't wasn't a lot of rest or a lot of sleeping going on at that time.
Not at all. It was a lot of 16-hour days for 4 months straight, but it was definitely worth it. It was still one of the most incredible experiences of my life, and I would do it all over again.
Now, that's incredible to hear after what happened in Georgia during that race. Just for folks who don't know or who don't remember, because so many crazy things have happened since then. What happened in that race where it seemed like the Democratic candidate, Stacey Abrams, was running a really strong campaign, and yet, as we know now, Brian Kemp is the current governor?
Yeah, so there was a incredible amount of voter suppression leading up to the election. Just a lot of misinformation about how, when, where to go vote. A lot of last minute changes about where polling locations were or their hours. And once early voting and then the actual general election day actually happened, there was also a lot of problems with especially mail-in ballots actually getting where they needed to go and getting counted properly. And with people who should have been able to go and vote not being told that they couldn't go and vote, which led to a lot of people either just not casting their ballot because they were told that they couldn't, or casting provisional ballots, which leads to a lot of issues in terms of making sure those get counted in a timely manner. And even if people have to cast provisional ballots, for many people, they come to the conclusion that that's not a real vote. And so they don't end up casting their ballot even when given that option. So it just led to a lot of people not being able to vote that would have and wanted to vote for Stacey Abrams and the other Democrats across the state. And there's still issues going on with that, and still a lot of work that's being done on the ground to try and reform the election system there, to try and fix the problems that happen and do whatever can be done to try and prevent it from happening in the future.
That's maddening to hear. What a lot of us outside of Georgia heard during that race was that Brian Kemp, who's now the governor, at the time he was the Secretary of State, his office was purging voter rolls. That was kind of what made the national headlines, especially using this new standard, I guess, if you want to call it that, of making sure everyone's name matched perfectly across documents, across databases, which is never going to be a perfect fit. sometimes a middle initial is used, somebody misspells something, and it, disproportionately was, kicking Black Americans off of voter rolls. That's kind of what we heard outside of the state. But you were saying a second ago that people were actually being told that they couldn't vote, or that they were being otherwise blocked from voting. How did that actually happen on the ground?
Yeah, so the purging of the voter rolls was, of course, we were hearing about it as well. It wasn't happening quite as much at the quite as high of levels in the region that I was in, as in more central and southern parts of the state. But that was absolutely happening leading up to the election. But actually, during early voting and on election day, people who had been voting at the exact same polling place with the exact same driver's license, the exact same name for years, some of them even decades, were showing up and being told either you're at the wrong polling place, or your name's not on the registration rolls, we don't have your name, or your driver's license isn't the same as what you registered with, even for people that had voted with all of that same information for years. And so on the day of, they're being told that, and like I said, some of them are informed that they could still vote with a provisional ballot. But a lot of times the way that that's explained to voters, at least the way that they were telling us, made it sound as if that vote may or may not get counted, even if they cast a provisional ballot. And so for lots of people, they're scared away thinking that they somehow did something wrong, and that they actually couldn't vote. And so instead of completing a provisional ballot, they would leave thinking that they weren't eligible to cast a vote.
That's just insane. So people who have literally had no changes in their lives were being told they were not on the rolls. So, but that does sound kind of like a result of rolls being purged. No, or was there something else going on there at the polling places where people were being obstructed or being kept from voting?
So I think a lot of it was the result of the voter records being purged, for sure. And then there was also a lot of, it was both purging people, and also from what we heard was Brian Kemp's office really doing their very best in terms of training a lot of the folks, that many of whom are volunteers working at the polls, who are working very hard, but are often told, like, if it doesn't match exactly what we're told, like as they're purging the records, that people can't vote, even if it's, they register exactly the same, what they're telling people, what they're writing down, all of that's the same. Even if they thought, had gone online and verified that they were registered to vote at that polling location, and at that address, then even if they can go online and look at the records, it says they're registered to vote, they're then being told by the records that they have at the polling location that they weren't eligible to vote. And so I think a lot of the results of that are because they had purged those records ahead of time, but then there's also either miscommunication or basically the communication between the online voter records and what was being used at the polls was not correct. They weren't matching up the way that they should have.
Which is bad enough as it is, but then what happened with people who actually were extremely cautious and thought ahead and brought their identification with them? They were still being told that their ID was no good, even though it was right there in front of them?
Exactly. And so because of, so that was happening to a lot of people. And so in the week or two after the general election, when we were finding out more about all of this happening, and that's in addition to all of the purging of the records that had been happening for weeks and months ahead of time that we had been fighting back against. Once election day had happened and we're hearing all of these stories and more of them, our field staff was going all over the state and getting statements from voters that had that happen, and trying to get accurate counts from every board of elections to try and figure out how many people came in and were either turned away because names didn't match or had to fill out a provisional ballot. Also trying to get accurate counts of how many ballots were mailed in, because some of the boards of elections counted those ballots, even though there were still boxes of ballots supposedly waiting at post offices to get to the Board of Elections. So yeah, it was absolute and utter madness.
So, but then this is where the story gets kind of crazier. Then after not just your team, but all these teams across the state, after they go and do all this kind of recon work and get everything they need, all these different ballots, all these different counts from different polling places, different boards of elections locally, then what's their recourse at the state level? Because, some states do have state boards of elections, but in most states, the Office of the Secretary of State, in addition to keeping records of corporations and nonprofits, also handles the oversight of campaigns and elections. So, unless I'm mistaken, Brian Kemp, the opponent, it was his office at the time who would have been the final arbiter of any of these election day or election time disputes. So what was the recourse once all this sort of reconnaissance was done?
Yeah, so you are absolutely correct. It was still his office, and despite calls from Stacey and many other Democrats and even some Republicans across the state who were calling for him to step down throughout the election, because having someone run for office, but especially running for governor, that is also running the Secretary of State's office, the one that monitors elections, is absolutely and utterly ridiculous. But he refused to step down until pretty much most of this had happened. And then what happened was the staff that were left in the office weren't 100% sure of exactly how to go about sort of making sure they had an accurate count of provisional ballots and of people that were turned away because they were told they weren't on the voter records, even though they should have been, and of how long they were supposed to wait to count all of these ballots, or when to do a recount versus a runoff and all of that. So there was a lot of confusion about that. And even after the staff that was remaining in the office was trying to figure it out, there was just a lot of people saying, we're not sure what to do. We need to do something, but we're not sure what to do. So Stacey's team, a fantastic legal team, mounted as many fights as they could against this to try and make sure that all of the votes that should have and would have been cast were counted. So there was a number of lawsuits that were filed, and I will be completely honest with you. In the days and weeks that followed the general election, I was so sleep deprived and exhausted from everything that had led up to that, but also from running around the state trying to get, these ballots and these lists and these affidavits and everything we could, and trying to talk to tens of thousands of voters around the state, that all of the lawsuits kind of blurred together in my head. But they were filing quite a few of them to try and make sure that they didn't make the results official until we could make sure that all of the votes had been counted. And even when Stacey never conceded, she said that she accepted that Brian Kemp had been declared the winner, but not that he had gotten more votes or that he should have won or that she was saying that she had lost, but she understood that he was being declared the winner of the election. She still was fighting, and still actually is fighting, her and Fair Fight Georgia, to make sure, to figure out what happened to all these ballots. Because I talked to people that said they worked at post offices where they still saw boxes and boxes of mail-in ballots, even after Kemp had been declared the winner.
So not even provisional ballots, but normal mail-in ballots were just sitting there in the post office in boxes going uncounted?
That's what we were hearing. And so, and I know that there was, for most of them, we were able to try and get them out of the post offices and to the election offices to be counted. But it was still, part of the issue with it is, if it took voters and citizens coming forward and saying, this is what we saw, or this is what our experience was, to even bring light to that, what was happening. And even if we were able to find as many of those ballots or try and get people's provisional ballots certified, it still opens up the question of how many more are left, how many more people couldn't vote, or how many people were we not able to get in touch with after they cast provisional ballots because they had to go in and certify that it was theirs again, for many people that cast provisional ballots. And so it just opens up the question of, even with all of that work that happened both on the field and legally, how many more votes were left uncounted.
That's just incredible. So then, after the general election, we proceeded to a runoff. Can you explain what that means and how is that different than a recount?
Yeah, so we went to a runoff for 2 statewide positions. So it was the Secretary of State was the biggest one, and it was our chance to go from, I mean, obviously, Brian Kemp was not going to go back to being the Secretary of State, but to get a good Democrat and somebody who had supported Stacey and supported the field work and was part of the coordinated campaign the whole time, to really try and get someone in that office that was going to pay attention and was going to make sure that voters were able to vote, because that's the entire purpose of that job, I mean, among other things. And so that was the runoff was a whole new vote, pretty much. So it was not going back over the votes that had already been cast. It was asking people to go to the polls. It ended up being about a month later, but by the time that the current Secretary of State's office had sort of tried to count as many of the votes as they could across the state and figure out what was going on, it ended up only being about 2.5 weeks, I believe, between when they called for a runoff and when the election actually happened. So it was a very, very quick turnaround. But yeah, so it was for 2 different offices, not the governor's office. So there was not a runoff for Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. Unfortunately, it was determined that the number of votes that were potentially left uncounted or sort of uncertified was not enough to go to a runoff. It was very, very close, but it did not go to a runoff.
Question, though, who made that determination?
Yeah, so very good question, Christian. So that would be the Secretary of State's office.
Brian Kemp, the opponent, then.
So, but by that time, he had stepped down.
But it was still his staff on board, I'd imagine. They couldn't change the entire office in a day.
Yep, so it was his staff. So it was entirely his staff that he had been supporting and supervising up and hiring, I'm sure many of them up until that point, that made that determination, which is why many voters that we talked to leading up to the runoff, unfortunately, had no desire to go back to the polls because they didn't feel like their vote was going to be counted. They felt like the first time around, it was hard enough for them to get their vote counted. And in some cases, they weren't able to tell if it actually had been counted. And so for many of them, they didn't feel like it was worth their while to go back, even though they knew how important it was. They just thought that, well, it didn't matter if they voted or not because they weren't the ones making the decisions. It was people in offices, not the actual voters.
But see, isn't that one of the greatest evils of voter suppression tactics, whether it's purging the rolls or sowing confusion or any of this? It's not just the strict number of people whose votes are rejected, whose ballots are rejected, or the number of people whose names are removed from the polls. It's also how many people are deterred from voting altogether because of the news of these things happening and them simply not wanting to go through it all.
Absolutely. That is one of the most horrific parts about it, is what Stacey and her field team and our staff and volunteers all over the state did was something completely unprecedented in Georgia's history of reaching out to voters. One hand, getting people registered and making sure their registration was up to date that hadn't ever voted, or it had been even sometimes decades since they had, and getting people riled up and finally feeling hopeful about the process and having somebody that was going to fight with them and for them, and that their voice was being heard in elections and in politics. And then to have that happen was such a big slap in the face, and was such a horrifying thing that all of these people that had come out, had stood for hours in line, in the rain, in the cold, in all of this, had fought so hard, were then basically told, oh, well, that doesn't matter. You know, your vote may or may not count. It really doesn't matter. And it still breaks my heart thinking about that, and each and every one of those people that did something that was terrifying to them, or that was new or different, or that they were told that they shouldn't go and vote and they went and did it anyway. And then nobody knew if, you know, the results weren't what people actually voted for.
Well, we should also note, too, that Georgia, I mean, obviously it's a southern state. It is a state that was, under the Voting Rights Act, it was covered by a provision of that act that up until Shelby County, a different southern county, sued the Obama administration to basically get rid of the VRA. And the Supreme Court, of course, decided with them. Up until that, you know, Georgia was one of the states that, before it changed any election law policies, needed to get pre-clearance from the federal government because of its incredible, awful history of voter suppression tactics, chiefly executed against Black Americans in that state. But as we see, since that Supreme Court decision that struck down that provision of the Voting Rights Act, Georgia once again got right back at it and kept a lot of people from voting. And then once people were either dissuaded or blocked from voting, they really had no one to turn to, because Georgia was on its own to kind of make up its own rules as it went.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, sometimes thinking about this and talking about it, it feels like there's no words to really encapsulate how atrocious it is, and just how much it often, I mean, being there during this time kind of felt like being in more of a dystopian novel than living in the US often already feels like. It just felt so ridiculously bizarre, and yet this is the reality that we live in, where everybody talks about, you know, you hear Republicans talking all the time about how voting is so important and essential to our political system, and yet people can't vote. They're being stopped from being able to exercise that very, very basic but such important civil right. They're just not able to do that. And it's not a mistake. It's not sort of a slip of the finger, you know, in a database. It's very, very intentional. And I think Stacey's election made that very, very clear how intentional it is.
No, absolutely. And, you know, you brought up an important point earlier, that what was going on up until this all happened during the campaign was really unprecedented in Georgia's history. That is, reaching out to sort of previously scared or apathetic or unregistered voters, people who were not normally part of the process. But let's not forget why they, in all likelihood, weren't part of the process to begin with. It wasn't always through apathy. A lot of it was because of these sort of practices being used throughout the state's history, so that people, even if they wanted to, effectively could not exercise the franchise. I mean, what Stacey Abrams' campaign and her work before she ran for office, what that arguably was about, was putting in a ton of real people work way in advance of an election to, at least in part, undo some of that sort of state-sponsored apathy, I would say, sort of undo that lack of civic participation. And it, just as sure as her campaign worked to undo it, Brian Kemp's office really went out of its way to bring back all the dirty old tricks.
Exactly. But I think that's why I said it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, and I would do it all over again, because seeing the number of people that were so energized by everything she had been doing in office and was doing on this campaign, and that they were being told, your voice matters, let's work together to fix our state and our country, and that we want to hear what matters to every person in every corner of the state. We were literally in every single one of the 159 counties of Georgia talking to voters. And sometimes that meant driving an hour between houses to go knock on people's doors that had never had somebody from a political campaign come to their neighborhood, much less their door themselves. And to have that happen, despite all of this, and despite having the candidate for governor running the Secretary of State's office, was an incredible thing. And just the number of people that, what happened after or throughout the election of disenfranchising voters was absolutely horrible. And it scared a lot of people away from voting. But I think even more so, I think Stacey and her team not backing down on it to make sure that every vote was counted, I think also energized a lot of those people that were re-engaged and re-excited to be voters. And so I think that, as horrible as it was, I think it started something brand new for Georgia that's going to be incredible in the years to come. And I can't wait to see what happens from that, which is a terrible thing to say coming from something that was such a horrible thing. But I think that, it's people will rise up once it's made so clear how much they're being pushed down, that it's not just sort of a side note, that it's really conscious attempts to keep voters suppressed and quiet, and especially to keep voters of color suppressed and quiet and away from the polling places.
Yeah, I really do miss your boundless optimism. I wish you lived closer.
Me too. Well, I mean, it's why I like Field. It's why I will always stick with Field, because even if it's just, even if I'm being yelled at every door and at every phone call, that one person I talk to who thanks us for being there, who says, oh, there was this one older woman I talked to. She had to have been in her 80s, and she told me that she used to go and vote every single time with her husband. He passed away last year, and it made her cry. Like, she was crying at the door with us, but she was so excited to go and vote for Stacey, and she was going to go by herself, and she was really scared about it because she'd never done it before, but she knew she had to, and she could not wait to go and vote for Stacey. And we followed up with her afterwards, and she'd been voting at that same polling place her entire life with her husband. And when she got there, they made her cast a provisional ballot, and she did it. And she was upset, but when we talked to her again, she was so pissed off about it that she was like, oh, they can't stop me from voting. They ain't never going to stop me from voting. And so, like, that one person that still got pushed down and was like, oh no, you can't do this to me, that keeps me going. And it's just such a amazing thing to see. People will always bounce back up.
I think that there's really no way that we can go up from here. I think you've put the most optimistic spin on this possible. And yeah, it's not a bad thing. Usually these days, at the end of an episode, where kind of whoever I'm talking to are trying to, we're kind of grasping at straws, trying to figure out what's the good news here. But that's poetic. That's beautiful. I mean, it really is a true testament to the character of so many people in this country who, especially older folks like that, and in the South in particular, who remember just how hard they had to fight for the right to vote, and they're not going to give up anytime soon.
Exactly. They're teaching their kids and their grandkids and their neighbors who are passing it along, and hopefully people won't ever forget that.
So for people who are not already so involved, maybe people who are considering getting involved for the first ever time, what would be your advice? How can people be most effective at making positive change, not just, in society, in the world, but concretely in our politics? What can people do to get involved?
I think at the simplest, most basic level, it's talking to your neighbors, talking to those people that you've never met before. I think so many people don't know the people that live in their neighborhood. Just talking to them, I think starting a conversation, even if it's not about politics, we all have similarities in our lives, and politics is not far and away from all of us. It is personal. It is in our lives, in our neighborhoods, in our homes. We can't ignore it. But it all starts with having those conversations. And I think that getting involved is the best way to do that. And there's so many different ways to do it. Some people get involved with their city, state, county, like Democratic Party, or political party of choice, I'll say, for those states that have more than two really active parties. But there's also so many groups to get involved with, because, everybody has some issue that they care about, and there are groups fighting for that every day. I think that there's ways to get involved, and it's having those conversations and making sure that your friends and neighbors and family know that there are people standing up and fighting for what's right. And so not being afraid to get involved, if that means going to a candlelight vigil to close the detention centers, if that means going and locking yourself to a detention center to get them closed down, if that means knocking on doors or making phone calls for an election, it is all doing that really, really important fight. And there is nothing that is too small to make a difference. As cheesy as that sounds, it is absolutely true. And I think so many people that volunteered on Stacey's campaign were scared. Like, the idea of making phone calls to strangers or knocking on a stranger's door terrified them. But they realized that the only way that we make change is by reaching out to those neighbors, those voters that don't feel safe voting, feel disenfranchised, or don't feel like it makes a difference. And the only way it makes a difference is if we work together at it. It's, one vote itself on its own doesn't make a difference, but one vote talking to their neighbor, talking to their neighbor, talking to their neighbor about why it's important does make a difference. And so I think just not being scared or feeling like you're too small to do something, get involved with it. It doesn't matter what it is, do something, get started with it. Don't let the world crush you. Again, as cheesy as that sounds, there's so much that can be done if we just aren't scared to do it.
Lila, I think the campaign should hire you as a motivational speaker for their staff before they actually kick off the campaign.
Well, thank you, Christian.
Get all the troops roused. I think that should be your new thing.
Well, that's kind of what I feel like doing field. I kind of feel like that's my job. Like, as a regional field director, my job was to support field organizers, and the ones I worked with were incredible. None of them had ever been staff on a campaign before. And by the end of it, like, I would want any of them to be part of my team in the future, because they cared so much. They were like, well, this is hard and terrifying, and they're not giving us any breaks, which, by the way, is not okay. But, they're working people really, really hard, but they were willing to do it because they had to. And I mean, that's an incredible thing to see.
It is. It's amazing. And I hope that more people get involved and help carry some of that weight and get engaged in the process, and now we'll use another democracy cliche. Democracy is not a spectator sport. So we actually, if we want to have the representation that we claim we want to have, we have to actually get involved and work for it.
Absolutely. You are very, very right.
Well, Lila, thank you so much for coming on Keep It in Perspective. I really appreciate your perspective and your insights onto what's going on in our democracy, especially down in the South.
Thanks for having me, Christian. It was really good talking with you.
You as well. Hey there, and thanks again for listening to Keep It in Perspective. I just have a small favor to ask you. While you're here, if you wouldn't mind, please give us 5 stars on iTunes and leave a good word if you don't mind. It seems like a small thing, but it actually really does help more listeners find this podcast, listeners who might enjoy it as much as you do, hopefully. If you really like this episode, you can, of course, also share it on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to follow me, Christian Hanley, on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Christian Hanley Official. Thanks again.